Welcome to the Friday edition of One's World, and I will use this video as the conclusion of my series on God. Although I haven't labeled it God number 4, I've labeled it prayer because I want to talk specifically about prayer, which you can think of as talking to God. Now, the question is, what does talking to God do? What does it look like? And what is its effect? And part of the answer to that question is dependent on what you think God is. So let's answer that question. The last time I ended up saying that my idea of God is something like the collective consciousness of the universe. Well, that's tricky when it comes to prayer. How do you communicate with the collective consciousness of the universe? If you conceive of God as emperor, all right, then you talk to the emperor in a very low tone, head bowed, supplicant. Oh, you are so mighty, you are so powerful, you are so wonderful. Would you please grant me this small favor out of your capacious and endless wisdom, mercy, funds, whatever. Or if you're thinking of God as Dad, then you might be a little bit more colloquial, but still respectful. And it reminds me a lot of the Lord's Prayer. Now, I've got my own thoughts about the Lord's Prayer, particularly when it comes to reciting formulaic prayers, and as part of a long-standing Presbyterian Calvinist tradition, I don't like formulaic prayers at all. I don't like to recite prayers repetitively or chant them or whatever. I prefer prayer that comes from the heart. But the Lord's Prayer does have some interesting components to it that I like to think about in more general terms. Because I have a feeling about prayer that is somewhat akin to what C.S. Lewis is supposed to have said. Somebody apparently once asked him, "Oh, do you pray in order to change God's mind?" Which, of course, a lot of people think prayer is all about, like God's going about his business and you interrupt his business and say, could you just help me cure my mother right now? Or could you help me increase my bank account? God's not thinking about that, but you put it into his mind and he then decides. Or maybe God, this is a very old-fashioned doctrinal view, but God makes you sick for some reason, and you pray to change his mind and say, no, make me well again. They're all very simplistic, and of course they have nothing to do with my conception of God as a universal consciousness, and would be pointless to pray those kinds of things to a universal consciousness. But the Lord's Prayer sets up some ideas that I've often thought about, and we can just run through it very quickly. You may know it anyway. Starts off, Our Father. All right, well, that tells you something about how it's being conceived, that God is being conceived as Father in heaven. And then a little bit of the praise, sort of emperor style, hallowed be thy name. Also interesting that we tend to use the Elizabethan language, which includes the second person singular, thou, thy, thine, etc., which is actually quite remarkable, because as in Romance languages, the singular form is informal, primarily used between equals, and when it's used between unequals, it's used down the chain. That is, the person above, let's just call him the emperor for the moment, king, whatever. The king will call all of his subjects thou, and they will use thy, thine, downwards, and the subjects use you upwards as a form of respect. So it's quite remarkable in the Elizabethan dialect that Christians are given the opportunity to use the intimate singular second person to God. It ought to be you, but instead it's thy. So hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. I'll come back to that in a minute. The next part says, give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and lead us not into temptation. Now, it can sound like that prayer is a prayer asking God to do something, but you can actually reframe it as directed inwards to yourself, so that instead of give me my daily bread, and bread, of course, in this context doesn't mean just bread, it means food, as in breaking bread means having a meal. So my daily bread means it sounds like give me enough so that I can live for a day, but it could also be turned inward to mean help me to be satisfied with the things that I need and no more. Just let me be satisfied with my daily bread, and help me not to be tempted. You know, that's a very, very, very deep theological problem when people say, well, how can God tempt us to be evil? Well, if we turn it inward, we can say that the prayer is possibly saying, please help me not to be tempted. And I'm sorry for the temptations I had in the past, and I hope you forgive them, but you're also asking yourself to forgive yourself, and that is so difficult, that we hold on to things that we've done wrong, the mistakes we've made over and over and over, and asking somebody else to forgive us is a lot easier than forgiving ourselves. So if we could then go back to the early part of the prayer, we can see that it is setting the tone or the context. It's saying, thy will be done. That is, I need to be a part of that. I need to be working towards producing God's will on earth as I perceive it to already be happening in heaven. That would include being loving, being kind, being caring, being generous. And not just make it so, like God just make the earth better. It can be also saying, help me to make it better. Help me to be a better person. Now that's the kind of prayer that you can, at least in theory, direct towards a universal consciousness.
Now, here's the problem as I see it. That is, if you conceive of God as an emperor or as a father figure, then prayer is relatively straightforward, much like a mental email, I guess. This is what I want, and this is what I think of you, and so on. And an awful lot of Christians characterize prayer in that way. They'll often say, look, if you are asking for something from your Father, then you don't just come right out with it, you have a conversation. So they think of prayer as a conversation. Well, I don't think of it that way, because I don't think of the possibility of having a conversation with a cosmic consciousness. There are people who do believe that they can get in touch with the cosmic consciousness, though, not usually Christians, usually Buddhists, and they use meditation for that purpose. And that is the way that I conceive of prayer. Not as Buddhist meditation. I don't have much experience with that and don't care to, because that would take years and years and years of my life in a monastery somewhere, and I'm not really willing to do that. But I am willing to contemplate prayer as meditation. And one of the ways I do it is to sit in silence, in solitude, in a place that is congenial to me, where I can simply live with my thoughts and I can focus on one thing. And I can spend my time, however long, could be half an hour, maybe longer, just dwelling on the thought of the thing that is particularly troubling to me at the time, or something I want to resolve, and to sit in quiet contemplation of that thing, not in a kind of rabid, logical thinking way, but just holding the thought in my mind and allowing it to sit there and to mature as I meditate on it, and to, one hopes, find some resolution, which is not always very easy. But what I'm really attempting to do is to get outside of my consciousness into a larger consciousness, which in that respect is very close to the Buddhist ideal, but I'm doing it in a rather different way. See, what I am attempting is a kind of expanded consciousness, a consciousness that is not limited to me as an individual, but is merging my consciousness with something much larger. And then the question inevitably arises, well, how successful are you? And I think the simple answer is probably no more or less successful than conventional prayer. That sometimes I'm distracted, I can't really focus, I can't really meditate properly, and things get in the way. Sometimes the problem I am seeking some kind of resolution to is intractable. And sometimes I come up with an answer and I'm satisfied with it. So it's no better or worse than conventional prayer. Like sometimes the answer is, yeah, we can help you with that. And sometimes the answer is, no, I can't help you with that. So in that respect, I'm fairly traditional, but I'm just using prayer in a very, very different sense. In fact, I'm defining it in a quite different way. Well, I'll leave it there for the moment. I think I'm going to have more to say about prayer in the future, but I'll leave it with what I've said today for the moment, and probably move on to do a bit of cooking on Tuesday just to break things up a little bit. And meanwhile, please tell your friends, like, subscribe, and I will meditate on what the recipe should be on Tuesday.